Get out. I was 12 the winter that split my life in two. I am 70 now. If that opening sounds blunt, it is meant to be some days arrive and you remember the exact age as if it were a bruise you can still feel. Picture a gray morning, rain so steady it sounded like the whole street being brushed clean. On the windowsill sat a little blue china teapot with a chip on its lip, the kind of object you think will always be there, reliable as a clock. The teapot began to steam sooner than usual. My mum, Ellen, put a knitted blanket over my knees and told me to lie down. My father, Arthur, kept his chair by the hearth like a small, silent argument. When he sat there, the room grew rules and the rules did the speaking. I will name the people in this story. I will speak plainly about consequence, the ways a home can change shape and a child can shrink to fit into silence. But I will not lay out the details of what was done. That is not what this is for. What I will say is this silence is heavy. It presses into a life, flattens the edges, and teaches you how to be small so no one notices what is missing. If you're watching this on your phone on a commute, or sitting at your kitchen table with a mug, or pausing on a quiet evening, stay with me for a few minutes. I want to follow the small things that kept me the teapot steaming on a wet sill, the knitted blanket folded at the foot of the bed, the tin of coins I hid beneath a loose floorboard. Those objects kept my attention when words would not. They are the threads I will pull to show you how a life bent by silence can be slowly, very slowly, mended. I was born in 1955, in a two-up, two-down terraced house 2 streets from the railway line, where the sleepers held their breath and the chimneys counted the evenings. Our road smelt of coal smoke and Friday night chips. Washing lines laced 1 yard to the next, like neighbors gossiping in strings. My world was small and regular, school at one end, the corner shop at the other, and between them the map of our days. My father, Arthur, left before first light, and came back after dark with mill dust on his coat and a silence that knew the way to our front room. He had a chair by the hearth that no one else sat in, not because he said so, but because the air around it said so for him. When he folded his newspaper, the room seemed to fold with it. When he cleared his throat, sentences packed themselves away. My mother, Ellen, worked part-time at the hospital, a cleaner in sturdy shoes who knew every corridor by the sound of its echo. She mended jumpers with a neat backstitch, kept her purse in a biscuit tin, and could make a pot of tea taste like a small holiday. Mornings began with the radio on low, the BBC voice reading the weather as if it were a polite letter from the sky, and the kettle talking to itself. Our teapot was blue china with a chip on the lip, a pretty flaw you learn to pour around. Mum rinsed it with hot water first, because that's how you wake a teapot up. I learned seriousness from the way she did small things right. The window above the sink looked onto the yard, a square of concrete, a line of pegs, a back gate with a handle that shook in a southwesterly. On cold days you could see your breath. On good days you could smell the neighbor's stew and imagine theirs tasted better, just for variety. School sat on the far side of the high street, a red brick with rooms that felt too big when you were quiet and too small when you had something to say. I liked handwriting lessons. I liked how a good loop could turn your day around. At playtime, I kept to the edges, where the tarmac met the grit and the grit met the chain-link fence. I watched trains pass and counted carriages, convinced that numbers would keep me safe because they behaved themselves. The library, 2 doors down from the bakery, was my true address. I learned to read faces there, the librarian's kind, baffled half-smile when I turned up more often than the opening hours suggested, the way grown-ups' eyes soften when you hand a book back carefully. I borrowed stories about faraway kitchens with different kettles, and families who argued and made up all in the space of a chapter. It was a relief to see problems that ended. Evenings were for small rituals. Mum wiped the table with a rag that smelt faintly of bleach. Dad's boots took their place by the door with their own sort of authority. The blanket on the settee, hand-knitted by an aunt who visited on Sundays and never left without pressing coins into my palm, lived folded in thirds. The house ran on rules you could feel more than hear. Don't sit in the big chair, don't talk across the news, don't waste bread. I learned early how to be helpful without being seen. Dry up, fetch the coal, keep a pencil sharp. If I ever tested the edge of a rule, it wasn't by speaking. It was by gathering evidence of small freedoms. There was a loose floorboard under the bed. I found it by accident, then turned the accident into a habit. When Aunt Liz slipped me pennies, I saved them in a little tin with a dented lid. The clink of a coin becoming mine felt like a door I might one day open. I remember our street as a chorus of ordinary sounds. Bikes ticked when boys freewheeled downhill, milk bottles chimed in the mornings. The paperboy rattled like a one-man band. On Saturdays, the market threw its voice down every alley cabbages at a bargain. Socks at 3 for 2, talk so fast it made you laugh. Church bells on Sunday were the tidy kind that made you think God liked order as much as Arthur did. People nodded rather than waved. Most news traveled by eyebrows. If something was wrong, you knew it from the way a neighbor's curtains didn't open on time, or from how your mum stirred a pot after the lid was already on. Arthur's temper wasn't a shout so much as a weather pattern. The room cooled when he came in. Drafts arrived where there were no gaps. He wasn't cruel with words, at least not the sort you can quote, but he was exacting with silence. A look could move you. A pause could pin you. The big chair did some of the talking for him. If he felt generous, he'd let the football stay on after the news. If he didn't, even the radio seemed to apologize for having a voice. You learn, in houses like ours, to make yourself agreeable to the furniture. You learn the creak of a stair and the safe height of your own laugh. Mum loved small treats that didn't cost much. A ginger biscuit dipped in the first cup of tea, a paperback with a cracked spine from the jumble sale, a sprig of mint coaxed from a pot. When she took her uniform off the hanger, the day took a deep breath with her. She walked to the hospital in any weather, cheerful to the bus driver, polite to the clouds. She called me her steady girl, which meant I didn't start fusses. I didn't, mostly. I collected details instead. How the light fell across the mantel at 4 in winter, how the blanket's pattern made little ladders, how pennies feel warm when they've been in a hand too long. Sometimes when the mill siren sounded late, I would sit at the kitchen table and copy my homework twice for the comfort of knowing exactly what came next. I traced maps of places we would never go and wrote their names as carefully as if they were relatives. On the best evenings, Mum let me listen to the radio serial while I dried up. I tried to remember the twist for Dad, but when he got home, he only wanted the headlines and the kettle to behave. That was a skill of his persuading rooms to behave. I do not want to make it sound as if childhood was only a neat row of habits and hushed rooms. There were good things, the thrill of finding a perfect conquer, the kindness of a teacher who noticed when your shoelace broke and bent down to tie it, the way a winter sun can light a kitchen like you've been forgiven. But there was also the training of your own mouth, to say, "I'm fine" in 3 different ways, to laugh on cue, to swallow a question whole. If I had a talent then, it was for reading the temperature of a day. That, and saving pennies. Both felt like preparation for something I could not name. By the time I turned 12, the house had taught me most of its lessons. I knew which floorboard to skip, which cupboard door needed lifting before it would close, which task would win me a nod, and which would be invisible. The coin tin was half full, the blanket was soft with use, the teapot poured well if you angled it just so. From the outside, we were a picture you could frame. 3 people, 1 chair, a warm kettle, a roof that held. From the inside, we were a set of agreements preserved in quiet. If there were cracks, and there always are, they didn't show themselves as lines. They showed as echoes, a little longer than they should be, and as pauses that learned to speak on someone else's behalf. That is the landscape before anything changed. A narrow world, tidily kept, with small mercies and exact rules. If you've ever grown up in a house where the furniture knew more than you were allowed to say, you know the shape of it. I'm telling you this not to complain about what was ordinary, but to show you how ordinary can be the very stage on which a life turns. Later, in the rain, the teapot would steam sooner than it should, and I would find out what a room can hold without saying a word. For now, keep the picture. The chair by the hearth, the blue teapot, the knitted blanket folded 3 ways, and a small tin under a loose board, teaching a girl the sound of her own future in coins. I was 12 that winter, and the weather felt older than anyone I knew. The rain didn't fall so much as linger, settling into the mortar of the terraces and into the corners of rooms that had no corners before. The first sign wasn't loud. It was the teapot steaming sooner than it should, a nervous kind of whistle that made Mum glance at the clock, though she knew the time. She wrapped the knitted blanket around my shoulders and told me to rest. I said I had a stomach ache. It was true in a way. The ache just didn't live where I thought it did. After that morning, the house began to move differently. The big chair seemed a fraction closer to the hearth, as if the room had drawn breath and not let it go. Doors learned new sounds. A latch that had always been discreet began to scrape with an afterthought, a small metal protest. I woke in the night and found the blanket folded the wrong way, the neat thirds now an untidy half, as if someone had made order in a hurry. My exercise book lay open on the table with a page I didn't remember leaving open. My handwriting was mine, but the page felt strange, like a room you enter and then realize you're the last to arrive. At school, I started to write smaller. It's an odd confession, but it's what happened. Letters that used to loop and breathe learned to duck their heads. Mrs. Lane, who taught English and smelled of the sort of soap that comes in paper, held my book longer than usual. "See me after class," she wrote, "the kindest detention I've ever had." When I stood at her desk, she didn't ask questions at first. She handed me a clean notebook, plain blue, not school issue. "For your thoughts," she said, "not for marks." The way she said it made a hallway open in my chest. I nodded as if it were nothing. I took the notebook home and hid it under the mattress as if words weighed like coins. Arthur's rules didn't change on paper. That was the trick. On paper, we ate at the same time and said the same grace and watched the news at the same volume. But the pauses grew teeth. A silence that used to mean, "I'm reading," learned to mean, "Be careful." The chair did more talking than it had the right to. Mum's hands were busier. Tea towels were folded twice. The biscuit tin clinked less. Small economies became smaller, as if money itself was catching its breath. I discovered a loose board under my bed by accident, and accidents, when you're 12, quickly become plans. I had a tin with a dented lid from Aunt Liz. Once it held boiled sweets, then buttons, now pennies. I began to test the weight of hope in copper. A 2-pence coin is a serious thing to a child. It means a bus fare or a pastry or a long, long time at the laundrette with your mother telling stories. I wasn't saving for any of those. I was saving for something I couldn't name, in the way you pack when you don't know where you're going yet. The weather helped me hide. In rain, no one asks why you keep your head down. I learned the map of the pavement by heart. On the worst days, I could tell with my eyes on my shoes when we'd reached the crack outside number 23 and how many steps until the gate, like sailors counting knots. If I didn't look up, the world stayed the size I could manage. I became expert at managing, as some children must. One afternoon, a Royal Mail envelope turned up on our windowsill, damp at the corners. The ink of the address blurred into a kind of mercy. Mum put it by the sink to dry and said we'd open it after tea. I stared at it as if it might blink. The stamp felt formal, like a knock you hear before anyone's at the door. Everything important in our house arrived with that attitude: bills, notices, the cousin's letter from Birmingham saying she'd found work in a factory and was doing all right. I don't know what I expected from that damp envelope. I only know it belonged to the same day as my stomach ache and the teapot that whistled too soon. In my memory, the envelope and the teapot and the blanket all sit on the sill together, a row of small witnesses. I stopped telling jokes at school. They require a spare lung for laughter, and I was short on air. When children asked if I was all right, I used the local answer, "I'm fine." It's a good phrase in the North because it can mean anything. "I'm fine" can hold a flood if you say it flat enough. At night, I learned the different languages of the house, the polite tick of the clock, the difficult breath of the boiler, the tight-throated creak of the stair. On nights when sleep came late, I counted trains. I named them by sound: the heavy one at 11:30, the cheerful clatter near midnight, the lonely goods train that felt like someone taking the long way home. Mrs. Lane called me in again. No fuss, no form. She put a hand on the blue notebook and said, "You can write nothing at all, if that's what helps." That sentence sat with me like a chair I was allowed to sit in. I didn't write the story. I wrote around it. The smell of wet wool, the shape of my street, the weight of a coin, the sound of a man's boots when he isn't angry, but could be. Sometimes naming the edges is the bravest way to begin. I don't have a single line to mark where ordinary ended and something else began. It wasn't a door slamming. It was weather changing in a room with no windows. It was the difference between a teapot that behaves and one that hurries to boil because the house is listening. It was the way a child speaks less and notices more. I learned to be exact with my breath. I learned to carry my own temperature like a secret. If you are reading this on a bus or at your kitchen table or in a quiet half hour between tasks, you might know this feeling. Something is off, but nothing is named. You become a curator of tiny proofs. The blanket folded wrong. The envelope left to dry. The page turned you didn't turn. You hold them to the light and say gently, "I see you." That winter I began to see. What came next belongs to the part of the story where seeing becomes choosing. For now, remember the signs. Small as pennies and just as heavy. The signs did not stay small. They learned to arrange themselves like pieces of furniture moved by an unseen hand. The chair by the hearth edged closer to the center of the room. The clock seemed to tick more loudly at the exact moments I tried to breathe. Arthur didn't shout. He didn't have to. He possessed a patience that looked, from a distance, like calm. Up close, it was a net. You could be still inside it and still be caught. At 12, you want rules because they make the world add up. I had rules of my own: get home before the street lamps sputter on, rinse the teapot, fold the blanket in thirds, keep the floorboard secret. Arthur had rules that sounded like advice. Don't trouble your mother. Don't make a fuss. Don't answer back. The don'ts piled up until there was no room for a do that was mine. When he entered the room, conversation left first, then posture, then the bit of yourself that jokes. Whatever this is, he never named it. That was the point. If you don't have a word, you don't have a case. Mrs. Lane kept her eye on me without making my name a subject. "You're reading well," she said, which is how a good adult says you're breathing. She'd let me return the blue notebook on days when I couldn't bear to carry more than my coat. "It'll be here," she said, tapping the desk. Knowing something might remain in one place became a kind of medicine. The winter went on, and with it the house rules learned new strictness. A pause before you sat. A second thought before you spoke. Mum wrapped the world in usefulness rag across the sink. Purse counted twice. A joke kept ready for a neighbor in case the street needed a smile. If she noticed the weather in the room had shifted, she did the maths mothers do. What will keep everyone fed, and what will still be bearable tomorrow? When you're a child, you believe keeping things the same is the same as keeping things safe. The future teaches you the difference. One evening I came home to find my exercise book on the hearthrug. It shouldn't have been anywhere near the fire. The page was open on a neat paragraph about trains, the sort of paragraph that wouldn't offend a soul. Arthur sat in his chair. not reading the paper, not doing anything at all. He let the paper rest on his knee as if it were a sleeping dog. The fire whispered. I reached to collect my book. His boot tapped the rug once, a sound less than a word. I froze, not because of the boot itself, but because of the sentence it contained. Mom came in with the tea tray, saw everything, and pretended to see nothing, which is harder than either. She set the cups down with practiced accuracy. "Careful," she said, as if to the china, and lifted the book with a deliberate lightness that makes me love her still. She put it on the sideboard and tucked the corners of the cloth under the tray as if tucking in a child. That night I couldn't write. I didn't want my thoughts to live anywhere traceable. I tucked the blue notebook under the mattress and turned my attention to the coin tin, to numbers that behaved. 2 pennies, 4, 6, 12. I made small piles as if they were soldiers who would stand for me when I could not stand for myself. Under the floorboard, the tin sounded like rain in a different country, regular and unlike ours. At school, a rumor went round about another girl not in my class who had troubles at home. The phrase did a great deal of work for so few letters. Children know how to smuggle scenery into a sentence. I watched the rumor cross the yard like a paper aeroplane and felt the wind it made. If you've ever kept a secret, you know that the world fills with mirrors. The teacher's raised eyebrow is for you. The bell rings because of you. The conker that splits in your pocket is a message. None of it is true, but some lies keep you alive. I held my face steady and looked at my shoes. Arthur's patience morphed into arrangements. "You'll be home straight after school," he said one Tuesday in a tone that sounded like he was doing me a kindness. There wasn't a question in it. "Your mother needs a hand." Mum nodded as if to say he had said something normal. It wasn't normal. It was a timetable written on the air. That's how manipulation works in polite houses. Schedules turn to fences. He became exact about where things ought to be. The blanket belonged folded on the settee, not over my shoulders before tea. The coin tin, which he should not have known existed, became a general category. "No clutter," he said, which is how you tell a child to become invisible. I learned to keep the tin hidden deep and to keep my face a tidier version of itself. One night, after a day that had gone too carefully, I lay awake and heard the slow survey of boots on boards, the house being considered. The door didn't open. It didn't need to. Fear is architectural. It changes how a room holds your body. I counted breaths and coughed once on purpose to mark out my place in the world. The cough sounded like a sparrow hitting a window. I told myself it was enough. Days managed themselves, as days do when you are 12 and the calendar is built of bell times and buses. I still visited the library. I still returned books on time because I could not bear to be chased. I picked novels where bad things happened but were handled in chapters, where a reliable adult turned up by page 200. That is the narcotic of fiction when you need it most. The promise that someone is coming with a coat and a torch and a plan. No one turned up at our house with a torch, but someone did bring a kind of light. It happened in a corridor that smelt of varnish and damp coats. Mrs. Lane stood half-turned to the window. "You're staying for the reading club," she said, as if it were a thing we had already agreed. It wasn't a question. She handed me a slip signed by the head, a late pass. "You'll be home after 4. Tell your mum I said you're very good at commas." Commas of all things. I took the pass like a talisman. I didn't know then that small papers can move big chairs, but I felt the hinge of something lift. At home I placed the pass on the kitchen shelf where messages sit. Mum read it and held it a fraction too long, the way you hold a warm cup when your hands are cold. She nodded. "Commas," she said, as if the word might protect us, and slipped the paper under the biscuit tin. Arthur looked at it later and made a sound that meant nothing you could quote. "Don't be late," he said, giving the pass permission to exist. The pass survived its first day in the wild. I breathed differently for an hour. The reading club turned out to be 3 children, a box of donated paperbacks, and a teacher who pretended to need our opinions. We read a short story about a boy who steals apples and returns them. You could feel the moral from the opening sentence, which was a comfort. Afterwards, Mrs. Lane kept me back and said only this: "You can come here when you like. You don't have to explain." It was the closest anyone had come to opening a door. She didn't ask what for. Bless her for not asking. A child needs, first, a place to stand. Manipulation is tidy when it's done by someone who likes order. Nothing dramatic. A coat moved, a schedule altered. An eye kept on a clock. You find yourself apologizing for going to the toilet at a new time. You discover that thank yous can be used as leash handles. "Thank you," Arthur would say if I guessed what he wanted before he said it, as if I'd earned a coin of quiet. I collected thank yous and spent them on nothing. Then the thing with the notebook happened. Not the blue one that I kept out of circulation, but my school book, the ordinary one you hand in on Fridays. I came into the lounge to find its first page torn out cleanly, the way you might sharpen a pencil and put the shavings in the bin. The tear was neat. The wound was tidiness itself. "Messy work," Arthur said, opening the paper. He wasn't talking about my handwriting. Mum went still enough to pass for furniture. I stood with my hands at my sides because where else do you put them when the shape of your day has been corrected? Later, upstairs, I pressed my palm on the blue notebook and told it, silently, to survive. It did. A child builds systems to protect the pieces of herself that still feel like hers. Mine were simple. A place to go, the library, the reading club. A place to hide, the floorboard. A person who saw me, Mrs. Lane, and a number to count to when the house forgot how to be a house. When you have these, you can pretend you are choosing. Choice is a story we tell ourselves to get through a corridor. Sometimes it's true. The corridor to the reading club felt true. The Royal Mail envelope from that wet day came back to mind because another one arrived, this time addressed to Mum from the hospital. She tucked it under the biscuit tin, too. "It's nothing," she said, which is the word people use when something is trying to become something. She began working extra shifts, and extra shifts mean a child is alone with a house a fraction more often. You learn how long a kettle takes. You learn the ethics of how loudly to set down a cup. You learn that a closing door can be read like handwriting. There was a Sunday where everything held its breath. Church, roast, football results, the usual spine of the day. Arthur fell asleep in the big chair, the kind of heavy doze that keeps the world in its place. Mum took her coat for a walk round the block and kissed the top of my head with a gentleness that contained a message I wasn't ready to read. I sat at the table and wrote a list. The coins I owned, the routes to the station, the shops that stayed open late. A plan in pencil is a wish with a map. I wasn't ready to run, but I was ready to know the direction of a way. When you live under a system, the first act of rebellion is often paperwork. Mrs. Lane suggested I apply for a Saturday job shelving books. "You're tidy," she said, with a smile that forgave the understatement. The library manager nodded at my neat columns and stamped something official in purple ink. A stamp is a door that clicks. With a job came a reason to be out. And with a reason to be out came a pocket of time that belonged to me. Arthur could hardly object to wages for the house. He didn't. He even said, "Well done," like he was handing me a safe object to hold. I took it and used it to widen the gap through which air might pass. None of this looks like drama if you're glancing from a bus. That is why so many stories go untold. The machinery is quiet. A chair, a pause, a page, a pass, a stamp. But add them together and you have a lever. I was 12 going on older. I began to think in future tense. In the evenings, I counted my coins and drew small maps with arrows. I didn't name the destination because names have a way of calling rooms to attention. I called it later. When the blue notebook finally filled its first pages, it wasn't with confession. It was with inventory. What I had, who I could trust, where a person might go at 4 in the afternoon in our town and not be remarked upon. On the last line, I wrote a name that felt like clear air, the one adult who had said, "You don't have to explain." That sentence would become a bridge in Part 4. For now, Part 3 ends with a child who can see the trap and is quietly measuring the distance to the edge. The first real help didn't arrive with trumpets. It came written in purple ink and carried in a teacher's pocket. I was still 12, winter leaning into spring, the pavements salted in patches like old arguments. By then, I'd built my small systems, the coin tin under the floorboard, the blue notebook tucked under the mattress, the reading club where commas were a code for care. Part 3 ended with a list. What I had, who I could trust, where a person could stand without being noticed. At the top of the list was a sentence. You don't have to explain. That sentence had a shape now. It looked like Mrs. Lane, turned half towards a window as if to shield me from the view. It began in a corridor that smelt of varnish and damp coats. "You'll walk with me to the office," she said. Not in the tone you use for trouble, but in the voice you use when crossing a road with a small child. You make the world slow down around you. In the office, she didn't sit behind the desk. She sat beside me on the visitor's chair and put a form between us as though it were a map. "Saturday shelving," she said. "The library needs careful hands." I nodded. Careful is what I had become. The form asked for simple things: name, address, parent's signature. The last line made my stomach tighten. Parent's signature meant Arthur's pen, Arthur's look, Arthur's slow, exacting approval. Mrs. Lane tapped the corner of the paper. "We can send a note to your mum through school," she said, as if she were telling the weather what to do. It's perfectly ordinary. Ordinary is a holy word when you're trying to pass between worlds. She wrote a covering note in her round teacher's hand. Margaret is reliable and precise. The library would be lucky. That adjective, lucky, sat in my chest like a small lantern. At home, Mum read the note and its promise of wages and nodded more to herself than to me. "It'll be good for you," she said, which in our house meant it might also be survivable for us. She put the paper under the biscuit tin, the halfway house for decisions. Arthur glanced at it over tea, made the small sound he made when facts behaved, and said, "Don't be late." The signature he added to the form was formal, almost handsome, as if he'd ironed his name for the occasion. A door clicked somewhere in the house that was not a door. The library manager was a thin man with a face that looked permanently surprised by kindness. "We do things by the book," he said, then realized what he'd done and smiled like a boy. He stamped my form with purple ink and gave me a badge that said, "Assistant." A badge is a quiet spell. It tells the world how to treat you. Shelving turned out to be exactly my sort of work. Numbers that behaved, spines that faced out, a system that rewarded any child who could read a sequence and keep their shoulders small. On my first afternoon, I learnt the alphabet of our town's stories and the exact music of a stamp landing on a date slip thwop and the promise of another week. Mrs. Lane turned up near closing. "How are commas?" she asked, like a joke the two of us could share in plain sight. She handed me an envelope with my name on it, school paper folded twice. Inside was another folded thing, a letter addressed not to me, but to a sixth form head at the comprehensive across town, where they ran a small Saturday program for younger pupils. Margaret has a disciplined mind and would benefit from structured extension. It sounded like a recommendation you might give a bridge. At the bottom, a line in a different ink. "If transport is a problem, ring me." Underneath, a number. Teachers don't just give their numbers. She had stepped closer to the window again, shielding me from something I didn't yet know how to face. Transport was a problem. The bus fare would chew through the coins in my tin like a careless mouth. I counted, recalculated, then realized that planning was a currency of its own. The library had a staff door. The staff door opened onto the lane by the market, where the Saturday bus ran late and cheap. The library manager, presented with the notion that helping me home on a Saturday would stop books from flying in the wind, agreed in the absent-minded way good men sometimes agree to miracles. Of course, he said, already counting a stack of paperbacks. I told Mum about the sixth form sessions as if they were an extra bit of shelving. I said structured, I said supervised, I said Mrs. Lane will be there, which she sometimes was and sometimes wasn't, but the sentence did the job of calming a house. Arthur looked over the rim of his mug and said nothing that could be quoted, which is as close as some fathers get to permission. The plan slid into the week. Even maps, if repeated, become furniture. On the first Saturday, I followed the market's voice down the lane, cabbages, socks, 3 for 2, and let the bus carry me past streets that never knew my name. The sixth form room smelt of dust and ambition. There were 3 of us from other years, all pretending we were older, all invited by a teacher who saw something measurable and decided to measure it. We were given a workbook and silence. I'd become good at silence. This was a different kind. It held, rather than pressed. When the clock hit noon, Mrs. Lane appeared with 4 sandwiches and an apology for the cress. "Don't look so alarmed," she said, handing me the plain cheese as if she'd read my mind. "No one is testing you. You're here because you can be." Because you can be. I put the sentence next to, "You don't have to explain," and felt my ribs make room. After the session, she asked me to wait a minute. She took a small card from her purse and wrote another number on it, this time not the school's. "For emergencies," she said, and looked at me in a way that told me we had agreed to different definitions of the word. She didn't ask a single prying question. She didn't use the language of disasters. She used practical nouns: bus, sandwich, pass, pencil, book. It is a mercy to be helped in nouns. Back at the library the following week, the manager introduced me to the back room where duplicates and donations lived. "You can take one if it's a double," he said, as a perk. I chose a battered copy of A High Wind in Jamaica because the cover showed a ship, and because its first page said something that made me feel the floor under my feet. Children are perfectly capable. Capability, once recognized, multiplies. I tucked the book into my bag and felt as if I had been given an extra pocket in my coat. Help, once it starts, arrives in alliances. The woman at the bakery, who had always given me the end roll if there were leftovers, began to wrap it before I asked. The bus driver started nodding when I boarded with the exact change that had taken 3 evenings to calculate. Mrs. Lane arranged for a small bursary. She called it a kindness fund that paid for the Saturday sessions without making a speech about charity. She said, "It's a pilot," which let us all pretend it might not last and therefore could not be envied. Even Arthur, presented with a timetable printed by the school and stamped in purple, waved it through with the absent-minded authority of a man who believes stamps are part of the natural order. The stamp was my passport. I kept it folded in the blue notebook like a pressed leaf. None of this unmade the weather at home. The chair remained a continent. The rules still spoke without using words. But a second map now layered the first. On the new map were doors I could open without asking, rooms where clocks ticked kindly, adults who used sentences that made air. I had a place to be that wasn't simply not here. With that came the first clean thought in months. I am not crazy. It is astonishing how far you can travel once that line is written. The last thing Mrs. Lane did before Easter was to hand me a brown envelope with a typed address, my name written formally, the way institutions spell care. Inside was a letter inviting me to a summer enrichment week at the sixth form. Extra reading, a trip to the university museum, a talk about apprenticeships. "It's just a start," she said, as if apologizing on behalf of the future for being early. But starts count. I nodded. Starts are the only things that count when you're building a bridge by hand. On the way home that day, the rain had the decency to wait until I'd reached our street. I let myself in with the key that knew my palm. The house smelt of tea and bleach. The big chair watched the room keep still. I put the envelope under the biscuit tin with the others and heard, in the quiet that followed, the faintest shift, less a sound than a possibility making space for itself. A mentor had stepped into the picture, and with her came small papers that opened larger doors. The next part of the story would ask for a choice. I had coins counted, a bus route memorized, and a sentence that worked like a key. I was ready to reach for the handle. A plan is a story you tell yourself until it becomes a door. By Easter, I had coins counted, a timetable stamped in purple, a bus route I could recite with my eyes shut, and a sentence that worked like a key. You don't have to explain. What I lacked was the moment you turn the handle. It arrived one Wednesday, early evening, when the house had settled into its usual posture, news on low, the teapot behaving, the big chair keeping watch, and Mum placed her hand on the biscuit tin for a second longer than it took to tidy it. She said, almost to the air, "You'll be late if you don't go." I wasn't going anywhere that night. The sentence wasn't about the clock. It was permission spoken in code. After that, time divided into before and packing. Packing was not the romance of a suitcase. It was the arithmetic of pockets. You learn what fits inside a coat you must pretend is just a coat. A blue notebook, 2 envelopes, one with the 6th form letter, one blank with my name written neatly in case anyone needed to prove I belonged somewhere, a library badge, a purse with exact change and a folded list, a small photograph of Mum at Blackpool with her hair blown wrong and her smile blown right. The coin tin, dutiful and heavy, had to stay under the floorboard. Money is useful. Noise gives you away. I tipped the coins into a cloth bag that once held marbles and listened to the tin become silence. Mrs. Lane didn't orchestrate an escape, she did something bolder. She made ordinary larger. "If you're ever early for the Saturday session, you can sit in the hall," she said, as if discussing furniture. The library manager did his own version. "Staff come and go by the side door, no one notices." Allies in tidy clothes had widened the corridor. All I had to do was walk. The day chose itself. A half day at school for staff training. A bus that met another bus. A forecast that promised the sort of steady rain that forgives a bowed head. At lunch, I told Mum I'd be at the library later, which was true. She looked at me with a care that felt like a hand on the small of the back, guiding without pushing. "Take your Mac," she said. Then, quieter, "Keep your badge where people can see it." That is how a mother says someone will treat you like you belong. At 3, I stood in our front room and rehearsed normal. Teapot off, cups rinsed, blanket folded, chair observed at the distance respect requires. I put the cloth bag of coins in my pocket and the blue notebook inside my jumper where it warmed to the idea of leaving. The door latch, polished by years of caution, lifted without complaint. The street received me the way streets do, without fanfare, with room to walk. The market lane knew my feet by then. I followed the smell of wet cardboard and oranges to the bus, counted the exact fare twice, and sat near the bell so I wouldn't have to ask. Outside, roofs gave up their water to gutters like a rehearsal for relief. At the main stop, I changed to the service that ran past the station. If you've never left in plain sight, it feels like learning a magic trick backwards. Nothing disappears. It simply stops being where it can hurt you. The station offered the formal mercy of rules. Buy a platform ticket. Keep it ready. Stand behind the line. I bought mine and held it flat so it wouldn't curl. Platforms are equalizing places. Everyone is going somewhere or pretending they are. I read the departures board as if it were scripture and chose the train to Manchester because Manchester was the word I had practiced. Mrs. Lane's number sat on a small card in my pocket, not to be used unless the ground failed. The ground held. When the train came, I let 3 people board before me so I could learn the rhythm of the step. I found a seat by the window and watched our town fold itself into smaller and smaller squares, as though tidiness were a way to say goodbye. My coat steamed gently. I pressed the blue notebook flat on my lap and wrote a list of facts so simple even fear could not argue. I am on the train. I have a ticket. I have a place to go. Someone expects me. Ordinary can be a raft if you build it right. At Piccadilly, I followed signs like commandments and made for the far exit where buses roost. The sixth form hall would be shut by then, but the library was open another hour. The manager looked up, surprised in his usual way. "Ah, there you are," he said, as if he'd misplaced me on a shelf and was pleased to have me filed correctly again. He found a mop excuse for my presence. This is what kind people do when salvation requires a reason, and set me to tidying returns while the rain tried to spell my name on the window. At closing, he locked the front door and opened the staff one. "Off you go," he said, not knowing the scope of the sentence. I went. The bus back ran along the top of the city where the wind keeps the streets honest. By the time I reached our end, evening had settled itself. I walked home as if returning from exactly what my badge said I was: assistant heart tidy, plan folded small. Leaving, at the start, isn't a single act. It is a series of ordinary permissions repeated until they become a road. That night, a child walked a road built of purple stamps, bus timetables, and a teacher's number on a card. The chair still waited at home. The weather had not changed. But there was a draft now, and drafts are how houses learn to breathe. The first door outside the house that had a handle I could trust was the GP's. Not trust as in tenderness, surgeries aren't built for tenderness, but trust as in a system with hours pinned to its chest and a bell that rings the same for everyone. Mrs. Lane called it an appointment, a word that sounds like a place you can stand. She wrote it on a slip. She even underlined the time as if certainty could be drawn thicker. The waiting room smelt of disinfectant and old magazines, chairs in rows, carpet forgiving of mud, a notice board where illnesses put up posters for themselves: flu, measles, loneliness disguised as, "Are you feeling low?" I checked in with the receptionist, who spoke without looking up, the practiced kindness of someone who keeps a queue moving. Name? Address? Any changes? I wanted to say yes to that last one, but change is not a category they can type. When my name lit the little screen, Margaret, room 3. I felt briefly like a person who had agreed to exist. The doctor was a man with careful hair and a tie that had once been hopeful. He asked about sleep and diet and school, and did not ask about fear, perhaps because fear is not a column on his form. I answered in the dialect of polite children. Fine, then more truth when he waded through it. He weighed my words like parcels, tapped letters into the system, watched the screen as if answers lived there. He examined me with brisk professional distance. When he asked permission, the word was so ordinary I nearly cried. He used phrases like symptoms consistent with stress and "we'll keep an eye." He offered a leaflet on talking therapies that might as well have been a map of a country I had not yet earned the right to visit. "We can refer," he said, the kind of sentence that pushes a thin boat into a large sea. He wrote on actual paper a note to school confirming I should be allowed to leave early for appointments. The note had a letterhead. Letterheads are armor. I asked, haltingly, if there was, someone to speak to without spelling the Y. He clicked, frowned gently at the screen, and printed a list. Child and Adolescent Service, School Counselor, a charity I'd never heard of with a number that began 0161. "It may take time," he said, in the voice of a person who knows that time is the thing you do not have. He didn't say home. I didn't either. We placed the word between us like something breakable and continued to work around it. Back at school, the admin office turned the GP letter into a pass that looked like a library card's older cousin laminated, official. The secretary slid it across as if I were being promoted to a better seat. "Show this to any teacher," she said. It was the first object I owned that could interrupt a timetable without getting me into trouble. I tucked it into the blue notebook. Paper is how you declare a boarder. The referral did what referrals do. It went into a system that moved at the speed of caution. Weeks. A polite letter. "We acknowledge your case." Another. "You are on the waiting list. Waiting is its own weather." Mrs. Lane found a stopgap in the meantime. The school counselor, a woman with sensible shoes and a room that smelled of tissues. "You can say nothing if you like," she said, using the same grammar as Mrs. Lane. I said almost nothing. She nodded at the almost as if it were fluent. She showed me how to breathe without apologizing. She said, "You're not mad," which is the kindest diagnosis I have ever received. On a different corridor, a different door opened the pastoral lead with a file and a pen held like a question mark. Safeguarding existed even then, in plainer clothes. "Is there anything happening at home that makes you feel unsafe?" she asked, laying each word down as if it might crack the desk. I felt my face become a mask of good child. "I'm fine," I said, and watched her write monitor. Monitoring is what institutions do when the truth can't yet be named. It isn't nothing. It keeps eyes on a door. There was also the matter of money, which systems care about because it leaves trails. The sixth form sent a bursary letter, terms, dates, a kind sentence about promise. The library put my name on a rota. These papers formed a raft. Arthur could frown at a child's feeling. He could not argue with a stamp. Mum gathered the letters into the biscuit tin as if collecting proof that the world had, at last, acknowledged my outline. One late afternoon, the GP's second letter arrived. Referral accepted. Appointment date in a building I'd never seen near the hospital. Mum ironed my shirt for it as if I were going to an interview. In the consulting room, the woman asked soft, exact questions that did not trespass but invited. "Are you safe today?" I said yes because the truth was complicated and today was technically true. "Is there someone at school you trust?" I said, "Yes, an English teacher," and watched her write protective factor. I did not know what that meant, but I recognized the warmth of it. We didn't speak the unspeakable. We named its shadow. She taught me words for the edge's anxiety, hypervigilance, coercion labels that fit like borrowed coats but kept rain off while you grew. She gave me exercises that looked like nothing and turned out to be lifelines. Count 5 things you can see, 4 you can touch, 3 you can hear. She said, "Your body is not the enemy." I wrote that down as if it were law. Outside, the world looked unchanged, all stone and bus fumes and ordinary rain. Inside, a tiny grammar had shifted. There were now official reasons to be in places that were not my living room. There were names for feelings I'd been carrying without receipts. There were adults whose job it was to hold a story at the pace I could bear. Systems are slow. Sometimes they are also steady. Steady is the beginning of safe. That night I placed the appointment card, the school pass, and the bursary letter under the biscuit tin and looked at Mum. She looked back with the careful pride of someone who has smuggled a child across an invisible border. The chair in the front room was still a continent, but I had, in my pocket, a small republic of paper with my name on it. Next would come the practice of living in that new map work, study, the muscle of an ordinary day that belongs to you. The work of rebuilding began as quietly as the damage had one small habit at a time. The papers under the biscuit tin had given me a strange new permission to have a timetable that wasn't written by fear. I kept the library shifts, added the sixth form sessions, and learned the craft of arriving on time to places that liked me back. A week, it turns out, can be taught to behave if you put enough nouns in it. bus, badge, pass, rota, book. When the referral letters paused, I used the gap for homework. When they resumed, I took a breath in a room that smelled of tissues and wrote down, with a borrowed pen, a sentence no one could confiscate. I am allowed to get better. Mum noticed the difference before I did. She put an extra slice of bread in the toaster without comment, as if feeding a future that had finally sat down at our table. Arthur, confronted with proof stamped in purple and signed by people in offices, found fewer angles to press. He still had the chair. I had a growing pile of small passports, passes, letters, appointment cards that said I could cross the room and keep going. On good days, the house and I called a truce. On better days, I left early and came home tired in a way that felt honest. School shifted from survival to skill. Mrs. Lane kept me busy with work that had a use, reading aloud to younger pupils, checking commas on the newsletter, helping catalog the library's donations with the manager who trusted me with the rubber stamp as if it were a ceremonial hammer. In English, we did a unit on letters. I learned how to ask for things in complete sentences that made adults say yes. I wrote to the sixth form about a summer placement. I wrote to the council about a travel bursary. I wrote, with my neatest hand, to thank the librarian for letting me put the romance novels in order without blushing. Each posted envelope felt like a string tied from our street to somewhere with wider pavements. The coin tin under the floorboard was almost empty by then. I took the last few coppers out one evening and held them in my fist until the metal warmed. It struck me that the tin had done its job. It had been a plan before there was a plan, and plans, once they mature, don't always need their training wheels. I put the empty tin on the windowsill next to the teapot, two small instruments that had taught me how to measure a day. The knitted blanket, washed and sun-dried, went back on the settee the way it should, folded in thirds, warm, nobody's mask. The sixth form placement led me to a workshop I didn't know I'd been craving. A Saturday spent with a visiting architect who showed us how to look at buildings as if they had feelings. Spaces either hold you or spit you out, he said. And I thought of our front room, of how a chair can govern the weather. He passed round tracing paper and told us to draw our street from memory, then draw it again with the changes we wished for. I put in a bench where the old men stood, because sitting lowers the temperature of arguments, and a small community room above the shop, because rooms with windows save lives. When he held my drawing up to the light, I felt something in my chest fall into place with the pleasant clink of a coin. By autumn, I had a modest, miraculous rhythm. Mornings, school. Afternoons, library or sixth form extension. Some evenings, GP or counselor, where the exercises had sharpened into tools grounding, naming, saying no, without apologizing for how English the word sounds in your mouth. I learned that recovery is boring in the best way. It's repetition with purpose. Sleep improved by inches. Appetite arrived without ceremony. I grew in the soft, sideways way children do when no one is timing them. The pastoral lead, having watched me keep my head above a bureaucratic tide, spoke to a careers advisor who spoke to a man at a local practice who sometimes took on Saturday students to sharpen pencils and put drawings in order. It's not glamorous, he warned. There's tea to make and paper cuts to earn. I was already fluent in both. The office smelled of graphite and glue. I learned the names of rulers that do more than rule, set squares, French curves, things that turn ideas into lines that stand up. I learned to hold a roll of tracing paper like a newborn and to say good morning to men who were surprised that girls had hands for this sort of work. Surprise is fine. Respect followed. Mum came to see the office once, standing at the threshold as if crossing into a different weather system. I showed her a sheet of elevations and she said, "That's a lot of straight," which was exactly right. She pressed a kiss to my temple in the lift and called me my steady girl with a new note that sounded like relief. At home, we started to leave the radio on a bit louder during the news. and I found myself explaining stories to her as if the world were a thing we could read together and not something that read us. There were setbacks, because there always are. A letter delayed, a night when the old map tried to redraw itself and I counted trains instead of sleeping. A day when Arthur moved the chair a whisper closer and I felt 12 in the worst way. But the new systems held. I texted Mrs. Lane, whose name in my phone was comma for luck, and she sent back a full stop. You are safe. A full stop is sometimes the bravest punctuation. Work brought money, and money is a kind of sentence adults cannot interrupt. I bought Mom a better kettle, the sort that clicks off by itself, and a second-hand coat that fit me as if the future had checked my measurements. I kept paying with exact change because exactness was how I slept. I put a small portion aside each week in a new tin, not hidden this time, but standing plain on the shelf. A visible plan. What rebuilding felt like in the end was competence. It was knowing bus times without looking, making a decent cup of tea under pressure, filing minutes for a meeting and catching a misprint before anyone else, carrying a tape measure in my bag because distance, named properly, behaves. It was also invitation, to think about courses, apprenticeships, the university whose museum I'd visited in awe. When the sixth form printed a flyer for an open day, I took one home, smoothing it flat on the table. The photograph showed students laughing in a courtyard, a scene I would once have mistrusted. This time I let myself imagine my own laugh interrupting theirs. I won't pretend I became someone else. I became more myself, and that is slower, harsher, better. The blue notebook, now half filled with lists that looked suspiciously like courage, sat by my bed like a sensible friend. The house still had its weather. My room had its own. If you had walked past our window of an evening, you would have seen a girl at a table and thought nothing of it. You would have been right. Nothing dramatic was happening. Only a life was learning its shape. By the time the work had a shape and my days kept time without fear, the future stopped being a rumor and started answering its name. I finished school, took the apprenticeship that turned into a proper post. And then the degree I once read about in a leaflet with my finger on the photograph, as if touching the university might make it warmer. Buildings became my grammar. I learned how a corridor can be an apology, and how a window can be a promise. I learned to draw rooms that hold people the way a good sentence holds a meaning without dropping it. The first project that felt like a declaration was small. A community room above a corner shop. The sort of place where homework gets done and kettles do most of the therapy. I fought for glass that didn't feel like a mirror, for a lock that shut without a clatter, for a sink at a height that made tea easy for tired hands. When we opened, the caretaker flicked the lights and said, "It feels nice in here," the highest compliment a building can earn. We put a blue teapot in the cupboard on purpose. A superstition, maybe. A little shrine to things that behave. Giving back was not a single gesture, but a habit. I set up a quiet bursary in Mrs. Lane's name, comma fund, because pauses save lives, and the first time a girl turned up with careful handwriting and a coat too thin, I handed her a pass and a bus timetable with the reverence of someone passing on a family recipe. I drafted a training about rooms that keep people, dull PowerPoint and all, and watched caretakers, librarians, and dinner ladies nod at the bits that were true. Professionals like words. The world is saved often by people with keys. At home, ordinary put its feet up. Mom retired from the hospital and took to gardening with a seriousness that made the roses behave. The big chair stayed, but its weather changed. Furniture loses its power when a house learns new grammar. On Sundays, I made tea, and we let the radio be loud without apologizing to it. I kept the old coin tin on my shelf, dent and all, not as a relic of fear, but as proof that plans can grow legs. Sometimes the blue notebook, now page-soft and more margin than paper, sat beside it like an old friend who knows when to be quiet. There were ceremonies I had not expected, ribbons to cut, hands to shake, rooms full of strangers saying thank you to walls. Each time, I looked for the child I had been and made sure she'd have chosen the seat with a view. When I spoke at the opening of a women's center, I said only this: a safe place is not a miracle. It is a set of decisions repeated faithfully. People clapped for the sentence. I meant every noun in it. I don't claim to have mended everything. I learned to live in a life that holds. The blanket on my settee folds itself in thirds now out of habit. The kettle clicks off with a tidy little bow. If a young person asks how you get from a heavy silence to a door that opens, I tell them, you find one adult who says, you don't have to explain. You collect the papers that give you room, and you keep walking towards lights that stay on. I was 12 the winter my life split. I am 70 now, and the kettle still clicks off like a small bow from the day. I used to think silence was a blanket that kept the weather out. It wasn't. It kept the weather in. What saved me were ordinary mercies repeated until they became a road. One teacher who said, you don't have to explain. A pass that let me cross a corridor. A room where the clock ticked kindly, coins counted into a plan. Nothing heroic. Just decisions kept. If you've been living in a hush so heavy it has learned your name, take this with you. You are not difficult for needing safety, nor disloyal for wanting a door that opens. Start small and stubborn. Tell one person who can actually help someone with a timetable, a key, or a duty of care. Paper is not the enemy. The right paper is a bridge. If your breath won't come, borrow mine. You are allowed to get better. If you're watching on a bus, at your kitchen table, or hiding in plain sight with headphones in, please reach out for support in your local area, your GP, trusted community services, or a reputable charity near where you live. If you feel unsafe, prioritize your immediate safety and act as soon as you can. Quiet help is still help. A small step taken today counts. And if you are the friend, the neighbor, the teacher, the bus driver, be the ordinary mercy. Offer a lift in the timetable. Offer a sentence that makes air. Rooms save people when people keep the room. I keep the old coin tin and the blue notebook in sight, not as relics of fear, but as tools I once used to cross a river. May you gather your own tools and one day look back from a room that holds you and think, I made it here by ordinary means.